Hey there. Tonight we're stepping inside the world of a medieval castle. A place of stone halls, narrow stairways, and small chambers where nobles, servants, and guards moved through steady routines. This is the story of life behind the battlements, of daily work, quiet moments, and the simple systems that kept a stronghold running. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. So dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the life inside a medieval castle. Castles varied in size and shape. Some were compact, built on raised ground or a rocky outcrop. Others spread across a wider area with multiple courtyards. Stone, timber, and earth formed the main materials. Thick curtain walls enclosed a collection of buildings. Towers rose above the walls at regular intervals. Gatehouses defended the main entrance. Within the enclosure stood service buildings, storage spaces, and the living quarters of the lord and his household. The arrangement balanced defense, administration, and daily life. Over time, the plan would be altered and extended to meet changing needs. Approach the curtain wall and notice its purpose. It marked the boundary of the castle. It was not decorative. It was solid, intended to resist attack and to control movement. Walkways ran along the top of the wall. Parapets and crenellations allowed defenders to observe and act. Towers provided vantage points and stronger positions at corners or gaps in the wall. In some castles, a dry moat or a water-filled ditch added an extra layer of separation from the surrounding land. Bridges, whether fixed or drawbridges, controlled access across this space. Step through the gatehouse when it was opened. The gatehouse combined several functions. It served as a checkpoint and a defensive structure. Portcullises, heavy doors, and murder holes could stop intruders. Meanwhile, gate chambers and guard rooms housed men who controlled entry and monitored traffic. In quieter times, the gatehouse also handled guests, merchants, and local people conducting business. The gate remained a place of practical exchange and of heightened alert, depending on events beyond the walls. Inside the main enclosure, the Great Hall formed the central interior space in many castles. The hall served social, administrative, and ceremonial functions. It was a place for eating in common, for holding court, and for receiving visitors. High tables placed the lord and his household above other diners. Long benches and trestle tables stood below. Windows were placed to admit light, though glass was scarce and often costly. Tapestries, wooden paneling, or painted surfaces offered both decoration and added warmth. The hearth at one end supplied heat and a place for cooking when needed. Over time, the hall could also serve as a sleeping area for some household members during busy seasons. Adjacent to the hall or in a separate wing stood the kitchens. Kitchens were practical, busy places. They contained large fireplaces, ovens, spits, and work surfaces. Copper and iron utensils, earthenware dishes, and wooden bowls filled the space. Food preparation began long before mealtime. Meat might be salted, smoked, or stored on hooks. Grains were ground for bread. Vegetables were peeled and chopped. The staff handled a range of tasks. Cooks, scullions, and kitchen assistants worked to produce meals for the household, the retainers, and occasional guests. Clean water, firewood, and storage arrangements shaped the rhythm of work in these rooms. Close by storerooms and pantries preserved supplies. Dry goods, salted meats, cheeses, and barrels of beer or ale filled these chambers. Some castles kept a separate bakehouse for bread and a brewhouse for ale. Cellars stored wine and perishable items in cooler conditions. Over time, storage practices adapted to shortage, surplus, and shifting trade networks. In winter, careful handling of supplies mattered more. Meanwhile, in times of siege, stockpiles and rationing plans could shape the mood and the daily routine for everyone inside. Private chambers offered quieter, more controlled spaces for the lord and his family. These rooms ranged from modest to large. The chamber provided a place for sleeping, dressing, private conversation, and small-scale work. A lord's chamber might include its own fireplace, a bed with curtains for warmth and privacy, and a small cabinet or chest for valuables. Ladies of the household used private rooms for sewing, reading, and managing the textile work of the castle. Servants maintained these spaces, ensuring bedding and clothing were clean and stored. Privacy remained relative, as attendants and lesser household members could be present when necessary. Linked to private chambers were smaller service rooms. Solar chambers, wardrobes, and studies provided specific functions. The solar served as an upper chamber often used as a family sitting room. A wardrobe was both a space for clothing and a storage area for household items. Meanwhile, chapels offered spiritual care. Regular prayers and occasional services took place there. In this way, the castle contained secular and sacred spaces, each with its role. Consider the defensive structures in more detail. Towers took several forms. Round towers resisted undermining and deflected missile fire. Square towers were easier to build and offered larger interior spaces. Some towers contained staircases, living rooms, or prison cells. In certain places, a keep or donjon stood at the heart of the castle. It combined residence and last resort defense. Thick walls and narrow windows made it difficult to assault. Battlements and arrow slits provided positions for archers. Machicolations and hoardings allowed defenders to drop objects or pour boiling liquids on attackers below. Over time, such features changed as weapons and tactics evolved. Hidden passages and secure routes existed in many castles, although their presence varied. Some passages provided discreet movement for servants and guards between rooms. Others served as escape routes in case of emergency. Certain castles included posterns or small sally ports, which allowed defenders to leave the walls unseen for sorties or to communicate with allies. Secret chambers and storage niches could conceal valuables or serve as prisons. In this way, the architecture combined openness and restricted access to suit different needs. Now move through the daily rhythm inside the walls. The day began early for many people. Cooks and kitchen staff worked before dawn to prepare bread and the first meal. Stable hands cared for horses, cleaned stalls, and brought fodder. Guards mounted sentry duties on the walls and at the gate. Meanwhile, household officers oversaw the allocation of tasks and supplies. The lord and his senior men might hold morning business, dealing with petitions, accounts, and legal matters. At the same time, women of the household attended to textile work, supervised domestic staff, or managed the household accounts. Sounds filled the castle, but they were purposeful rather than constant. The creak of wooden doors, the clank of metal, and the measured footsteps of sentries marked movement. Voices rose and fell as people coordinated work. The crackle of fires in kitchens and hearths provided a steady background. Bells or horns sometimes signaled changes in the day or alerted people to approaching visitors or danger. Over time, those sounds formed a familiar pattern for those who lived there. Smells also defined the environment. Cooking aromas of roasting meat, broth, and fresh bread mixed with less pleasant scents of smoke, damp stone, and animal care. Herbs and aromatic plants were used in food and for cleaning. Meanwhile, storage of grain, hay, and fuel added their own odors. In winter, smoke tended to linger, especially in enclosed spaces. In this way, smell provided practical information about activity and place. Routines divided the day into tasks and pauses. Meals followed a social order. The main meal often took place in the middle of the day. Smaller meals occurred in the morning and evening. Guests and retainers ate according to status. Meanwhile, weekday work continued in the fields or in specialized workshops outside the inner walls, where craftsmen produced tools, shoes, and metalwork for the castle's needs. People responsible for the castle's economic functions collected rents, received goods, and organized shipments. Over time, these routines kept the household functioning. Children and the young had roles in the castle too. Noble children received instruction in manners, reading, and sometimes languages. Boys training for knighthood practiced horsemanship and handling weapons under the supervision of older men. Girls learned domestic skills and the management of servants. Apprentices and pages carried messages, assisted in service, and observed the routines of the household as part of their education. In this way, the castle served as a workplace and a training ground. Workshops and craft spaces supported life within the walls. A smithy produced and repaired metal goods, including tools and weapons. A carpenter's shop maintained timber structures and made furniture. Tanners, cobblers, and coopers kept supplies of leather and barrels in order. In some castles, a small infirmary or space for basic medical care treated wounds and common illnesses. Remedies used at the time relied on herbs, salves, and basic surgery when necessary. Caregivers and women with knowledge of remedies took responsibility for health to the extent possible. Justice and administration took place within the castle in formal ways. The lord or his appointed officials heard disputes and managed local government tasks. Records of rents, fines, and legal decisions were kept in ledgers or on parchment. These activities required offices and clerks. Over time, the castle functioned as an administrative center for the territory it controlled. People came to the castle for petitions, to resolve disputes, and to obtain protection. Seasonal change affected daily life. In spring and summer, the surrounding lands needed attention for planting and harvesting. Workers moved between the manor and the castle according to agricultural needs. Market days brought visitors and trade. In autumn, preparations for winter included preserving food and securing supplies. Winters brought more indoor work and a quieter pace. During periods of threat or war, life changed again. Sentinels increased, storehouses were checked, and families prepared for the possibility of siege. In quieter times, the pace allowed more instruction, maintenance, and social life. Social life inside the castle combined formal obligation with quiet companionship. Entertaining guests followed established patterns of hospitality. Music, stories, and reading might fill the evenings in the great hall or in private chambers. Meanwhile, small gatherings and conversations occurred in the solar or private rooms. Relationships among household members depended on rank and function, yet everyday cooperation made the castle work. Over time, familiarity and repeated routine created predictable expectations for behavior. Maintenance was a constant task. Stone walls and wooden floors required repair. Roofs needed attention after storms. Water management involved wells, cisterns, and drainage systems. Craftsmen practiced their trades on site or nearby to keep the facilities intact. Meanwhile, household inventory required regular review. Furniture, linens, and tools needed replacement or mending. In this way, the physical fabric of the castle remained in regular care. Night changed the pattern of activity. Torches, rushlights, and candles provided light, though it was limited and irregular. Guards continued to patrol. Quiet prevailed in living areas, and lower-ranked staff often slept in communal spaces. The lord and his family might retire to their chambers earlier for privacy and warmth. Household routines slowed, yet essential tasks continued. Fire safety and orderly behavior mattered at night because of the risk posed by open flame. Finally, consider the human element. Life in a castle required cooperation among many individuals. Roles were defined, and expectations were clear. Authority rested with the lord, but success depended on the competence of stewards, cooks, smiths, guards, and many others. Over time, the household developed its own customs and procedures. That continuity provided stability, while adaptation met changing circumstances. In closing, the picture of life inside the castle walls is one of practical order. Architecture shaped activity. Spaces served specific purposes. Daily rhythms of work, sound, and scent structured the day. Fortifications and secret routes provided defense, while private chambers and communal halls offered places for living and governing. Over the years, those elements combined to form a functional environment where people lived, worked, and managed the affairs of a household and its territory. Rest now with the steady sense of that order, the calm of routines, and the knowledge that these strongholds were places of sustained, ordinary human work and care. Lords, ladies, and nobles formed a distinct social group in medieval and early modern societies. Their position rested on land, on rights, and on obligations to those who lived under their authority. They exercised political power locally and sometimes nationally. At the same time, they were expected to provide order, protection, and leadership. In this narration, we will describe the duties and privileges that defined their role, the manners and etiquette that structured their interactions, the education and leisure that shaped their daily life, and the clothing and personal care that marked their presence. The aim is steady, factual description, paced so that each detail settles into a clear impression. Begin with duties and privileges. A noble's primary duty was the management of land and people. Estates produced food, materials, and income. The lord or lady supervised allocation of land to tenants, the collection of rents and dues, and the organization of labor for planting, harvesting, and maintenance. Stewardship required record keeping. Accounts and memoranda recorded who owed what, when payments were due, and how resources were distributed. In larger households, A steward or seneschal performed these tasks on behalf of the lord, visiting manors, hearing complaints, and arranging work. Meanwhile, the lord retained ultimate authority to settle disputes and to enforce obligations. In this way, local governance depended on a combination of written record and personal oversight. Military responsibilities formed another important aspect of noble life. When called upon by a higher lord or by the crown, nobles were expected to provide armed men and horses. They kept training schedules for their household knights and retained soldiers. Over time, these obligations shaped how a noble arranged household resources. Armor, weapons, horses, and stables required investment and ongoing care. Castles and fortified dwellings provided both residence and strategic points for local defense. In times of conflict, the noble led men in the field or arranged for competent lieutenants to do so. In peacetime, the same structures and personnel served to maintain order and deter banditry. Judicial duties also rested with nobles. Many presided over local courts. They heard cases between tenants, judged lesser crimes, and imposed fines or penalties according to customary law. For more serious offenses, they referred matters to higher courts or to the king's officers. Records show that lords took this role seriously because legal judgments affected relationships among tenants, laborers, and household members. Meanwhile, administrative tasks included collection of taxes and the organization of corvée labor, which meant that the nobles' decisions influenced agricultural schedules and local livelihoods. Privileges accompanied these duties. Nobles held rights to incomes from land, to certain legal privileges, and to symbols of rank. They collected rents, fines, and fees for market use or milling. Exclusive rights, such as hunting privileges in nearby forests, could make a visible difference in daily life. Titles brought precedence in ceremonies and at court. Those privileges reinforced a social order in which nobles stood apart from commoners. Yet, they were also expected to exercise those privileges in concert with their responsibilities. Hospitality formed an important public and private duty. Hosts received visitors, advancing guests' positions through comfortable reception, food, and lodging. Ceremonial displays mattered for reputation, and so did discretion. In times of famine or difficulty, hospitality could place strain on household resources, and a noble's response to need affected how tenants and neighbors perceived leadership. In this way, generosity and prudence worked together in the management of a household. Turn now to courtly manners and etiquette. Courts, both those in great royal palaces and those at smaller noble houses, followed precise patterns of behavior. Rank dictated where a person sat when they rose and how they addressed others. Formal salutes and titles marked respect for status. Over time, ritual became a language. A person who knew the proper form of greeting, the correct posture at a meal, and the expected formulas for speech navigated social life more easily. Meanwhile, breaches of etiquette could carry real consequences. Offense taken in the presence of the lord might reduce patronage, while an unintended slight could lead to a feud, if not repaired through apology or restitution. Table manners formed an important area of etiquette. Meals were occasions for display and for business. The placement of diners indicated rank, and the serving of food followed a clear order. Guests were served by attendants who knew which courses belonged to which rank. elbowing and reaching across the table were discouraged, while use of communal plates or trenchers followed accepted conventions. In this way, even small movements at the table carried social meaning. Dress codes and appearance complemented manners. Clothing signaled rank and occasion, and rules governed what colors, materials, and accessories were appropriate for different gatherings. Meanwhile, speech and conversation had norms. Praise and flattery appeared in measured amounts. Boasting was tolerated in certain contexts, as in tournaments, but humility and restraint were expected in formal audiences. Gentle speech and controlled emotion expressed authority as much as words did. Gift giving and ritual exchange reinforced relationships. A lord might reward service with land, money, or a title. Gifts between nobles carried political significance. Receiving a gift could imply alliance, gratitude, or obligation. Over time, a network of reciprocal exchanges sustained alliances and hierarchies. In court settings, protocol steered such exchanges toward predictable forms, thereby reducing uncertainty in political life. Tournaments and ceremonial events required special codes of conduct. Participants followed agreed rules of combat, and spectators observed appropriate behavior. These events gave nobles an opportunity to demonstrate martial skill, to be seen by peers, and to settle reputations in a socially regulated setting. Meanwhile, diplomacy and negotiation used protocol to ensure clarity. Ambassadors followed elaborate customs when approaching a sovereign or lord, and these customs helped prevent misunderstandings that could otherwise lead to conflict. Education, literacy, and leisure formed a large part of a noble's private life. The education of children aimed to prepare them for their future roles. Boys destined for knighthood began training early. They served as pages in other households to learn manners and basic skills. At 13 or 14 years old, a page might advance to the rank of squire, training in horsemanship, weapon handling, and the management of armor. Instruction included physical conditioning, the care of horses, and lessons in battlefield tactics. In addition, squires learned to read basic phrases and to manage accounts related to military service. In this way, practical training combined with moral and social instruction. Girls received instruction suited to household management and social responsibilities. They learned needlework, spinning, and weaving. Education also included managing servants, supervising the kitchen and storerooms, and understanding household accounts. Noble girls sometimes received reading instruction, prayer books, and lessons in noble comportment. Those who later entered religious life followed different educational paths, often within convents that had libraries and teachers. Over time, variations in education depended on region, family priorities, and available teachers. Literacy varied widely among the nobility. Some nobles were well-read, kept accounts, and maintained libraries of manuscripts. Others relied on clerks and chaplains for writing and record-keeping. Latin remained the language of formal record and church matters for many centuries, while vernacular languages increasingly served for poetry, chronicles, and private letters. In households where literacy mattered, a chaplain or tutor taught reading and writing, and books became prized possessions. Manuscripts contained religious texts, legal codes, and sometimes collections of poetry or instructional manuals for knights. In this way, reading and writing connected the noble household to broader intellectual currents. Leisure activities balanced training and governance. Hunting provided both practical meat and a chance to practice mounted skills. Hunters used spears or bows, and falconry offered a refined form of hunting that required training birds and handlers. In the hunting field, nobles observed group discipline and learned to coordinate as a unit. Meanwhile, music and dance supplied evening diversion. Instrumentalists, singers, and skilled dancers performed in halls or private chambers. Poetry and storytelling offered another form of learning and entertainment. Some nobles patronized artists and poets, supporting creativity and enhancing their reputations in broader social networks. Games and pastimes included board games and physical contests. Chess served as a model for strategic thinking, while dice games offered social recreation. At home, nobles enjoyed quiet pastimes such as reading religious texts, copying manuscripts, or engaging in amateur study. Over time, the balance of leisure and work reflected the rhythms of seasons and social obligations. Festive occasions invited more elaborate entertainments, while ordinary days allowed for measured private pursuits. Finally, clothing, jewelry, and personal care expressed identity and status. Fabrics mattered. Wool, linen, and for those who could afford them, silk, formed the primary materials for garments. The cut and layering of clothing adapted to climate and function. Men wore tunics, hose, and cloaks, while women wore gowns with fitted bodices and flowing skirts. In colder regions, fur linings and heavy cloaks provided warmth. Over time, garments became more tailored and complex, especially in higher social circles. Color and dye indicated wealth. Rich dyes such as scarlet and deep blue required expensive pigments and skilled dyers. Meanwhile, embroidery, trim, and decorative elements added visible markers of distinction. Sumptuary laws sometimes regulated who could wear certain fabrics or colors, and those laws acted to maintain social divisions. Jewelry further signaled rank. Rings, brooches, necklaces, and elaborate belt fittings displayed wealth and sometimes bore heraldic symbols. Precious metals and gems were valuable not only as ornament, but also as portable stores of wealth. In this way, jewelry combined function, fashion, and economic security. Personal grooming included a range of practices. Hairstyles varied by region and era. Men might wear hair short or shoulder length, while women arranged their hair with braids, veils, or coifs. Bathing habits depended on availability of water and on custom. In some households, regular washing of hands and face was common, and servants assisted with hair combing and shaving. Meanwhile, the use of perfumes and scented waters helped mask odors from smoke or damp. Cloth and cleaning techniques also involved knowledge of soaps and herbal infusions used for laundering fine garments. Cosmetics had limited but distinct use. Pale skin often signified status, and some nobles used powders or creams to achieve a desired look. Care in dental hygiene took the form of basic cleaning with cloths or rudimentary brushes. Nail care and skin salves relied on simple ingredients. Over time, the specifics of personal care reflected changing tastes and the exchange of ideas through trade and travel. Attention to clothing and appearance extended to practical maintenance. Garments required mending, and seamstresses or tailors in the household or nearby town kept clothing serviceable. Shoes, belts, and harnesses underwent repairs by cobblers. In this way, the visible surface of noble life relied on a network of artisans and servants. Throughout these areas, duties and privileges, courtly manners, education and leisure, and personal appearance, a pattern emerges. Nobles managed estates, led military efforts when required, and served judicial and ceremonial functions. They navigated intricate forms of etiquette that structured social life. Their education combined practical training for governance and warfare with instruction in household management, and, in some cases, literacy and intellectual pursuits. Clothing and personal care declared identity and rank, while also depending on skilled craftsmen. Over time, these elements reinforced one another, shaping a way of life that combined authority, obligation, and sustained routine. Consider, finally, the human dimension. Behind the titles and the rituals were individuals who made daily choices about hospitality, training, and management. Their lives involved negotiations, compromises, and small acts of care that kept households functioning. Duties and privileges existed together, and success in one area supported competence in the others. In this way, the life of lords, ladies, and nobles rested on practical systems of work, learning, and display. Rest now with a clear sense of that order, steady and deliberate, each element contributing to the governance and continuity of the household and of the society it served. Inside the stone walls of a castle lived more than the lord and his family. A structured community of servants and common folk kept the household functioning. Each person had a place in a clear hierarchy. In this narration, I will describe that hierarchy, the wages and punishments that shaped daily life, the routines of peasants who lived within the castle grounds, and the differences between household servants and villagers in the surrounding lands. The intent is steady explanation, with attention to how ordinary tasks and rules sustained life behind the curtain of rank. At the top of the household staff stood officers who managed the household as a business. A steward or seneschal oversaw accounts, supplies, and the organization of workers. He kept records of rents and of payments, and he directed baking, brewing, and storage. A chamberlain or constable might manage the private chambers and the keep. A marshal or master of the horse cared for horses, stables, and the training of grooms. Under their direction worked a larger group, each with specific duties and a clear position in the chain of command. Household servants formed a layered group. Senior servants held supervisory responsibilities. The head cook supervised kitchen staff and planned menus according to season and occasion. The housekeeper or mistress of the wardrobe managed clothing, bed linens, and chamber arrangements. A steward supervised accounts and the distribution of provisions. Below them, ordinary household servants carried out daily tasks. Maids attended to cleaning, to laundry, and to tending fires and lamps. Scullions washed dishes and prepared vegetables. Cooks and pastry cooks worked at the hearth to produce bread, ale breads, soups, roasted meats, and preserves. Valets and pages performed duties near the lord, caring for clothing and armor and running messages. Guards and watchmen kept watch on the walls, patrolled the gatehouse, and stood at sentry posts. Meanwhile, skilled artisans such as smiths, carpenters, and masons might be attached to the household or live nearby, and serve the castle as needed. Roles required training and knowledge. Stewards learned to read ledgers, to weigh goods, and to interpret local custom for rents and dues. Cooks knew seasonal preservation, how to make bread last, and how to organize cooks for a large table. Stable workers understood harnessing, shoeing, and feeding for the different needs of riding horses and draft animals. Guards had training in gate procedures and in armament. In this way, the household depended on a balance of administrative skill, manual labor, and technical craft. Wages and compensation took varied forms. Many servants received regular food, shelter, and clothing as part of their employment. A servant who lived full-time in the castle usually had a bed or a shared room, access to household meals, and sometimes small provisions for family members. In addition, some households paid wages in coin, especially for specialized artisans or for seasonal work. Gifts, like a bolt of cloth at Christmas or a payment at Michaelmas, supplemented normal provision. Over time, monetary wages became more common in certain regions and among certain classes of workers, while other obligations remained largely in kind. Peasant laborers and tenants on castle lands often served the household through customary obligations. Corvée labor required tenants to work several days each week on the domain fields, on the castle maintenance, or on specific tasks such as harvesting. Rent might be paid in produce, in labor, or in coin, depending on local custom and the agreements between lord and tenant. Those who provided labor could expect support in return. The castle stored grain for lean months, provided a mill for turning grain into flour, and offered protection in troubled times. In this way, compensation balanced services rendered with seasonal needs. Working conditions varied from role to role. Kitchen work was physically demanding and hot. Cooks and scullions spent long hours over flames, and steam and smoke were constant. In the larder and cellar, workers managed cold storage and fermentation, tasks that required attention and care. Stable workers stored fodder, mucked stalls, and lifted heavy bales. Guards spent long watches on the walls, exposed to wind and rain. Meanwhile, laundry work required carrying heavy wet textiles to rivers or to washing areas, and then beating and rinsing cloths until they were clean. Over time, some positions gained status because of skill or intimacy with the household, while others remained grueling and low paid. Punishments and discipline enforced rules within the castle. Household regulations varied with custom, but common sanctions included fines, reduction of rations, temporary confinement, or dismissal. Corporal punishment also existed, though its use depended on local law and the character of the lord. A servant who broke an important rule might be fined or lose privileges, and theft or violence could lead to severe penalties. Meanwhile, the manorial court handled disputes between tenants and could require restitution or demand community labor as restitution for losses. These judicial practices gave structure to expectations, and they standardized responses to breaches of duty. Employment stability depended on skill, trust, and the personal relationships within the household. A steward or head cook who proved reliable could serve the same household for many years. In contrast, seasonal workers and day laborers moved more frequently. Some servants were bound to a household by custom or by apprenticeship. Others were free to leave for better wages. Over time, patterns of mobility and permanence shaped the composition of staff living under the castle roofs. Life for peasants who lived within the castle grounds combined agricultural labor with the rhythms of family and church. Many tenants lived in small cottages clustered near the outer bailey or in a village within sight of the walls. That proximity had practical consequences. Fields lay close, and tenants often brought produce directly to castle storehouses or to the mill. Common grazing lands and woodlands stood under the lord's control, and access to these resources was regulated. Peasant families worked seasonal cycles, plowing in spring, planting in early summer, harvesting in late summer and autumn, and performing maintenance tasks through winter. In this way, their year followed the demands of the land and of the household's needs. Housing for peasants varied. Some cottages had simple wattle-and daub walls and thatched roofs, with a single room where family life and animal shelter shared space. Others had divided spaces. Hearths served for cooking and central warmth. Furniture was minimal. Meanwhile, storage for grain could be communal or in the lord's granary. Basic household goods included wooden bowls, rough pottery, and simple tools. Clothing for peasants was functional: woolen tunics, homespun cloaks, and sturdy shoes. Over time, small improvements appeared as tenants prospered, and as trade introduced new textiles and tools. Daily life for villagers included domestic tasks as well as obligations to the manor. Women spun, wove, and repaired clothing, prepared meals, and cared for children. Men tended fields, repaired fences, and worked in the lord's domain when required. Children learned skills early. They helped with chores and gradually took on greater responsibilities. Social life centered on the church and on seasonal festivals. Market days and fairs brought contacts beyond the manor, and these occasions allowed exchange of goods and news. In this way, villagers balanced local obligations with occasional opportunities to trade and to travel. Health and diet differed between servants who worked inside the castle and peasants in the village. Castle servants often had more varied access to meat and preserved foods, at least when the household had resources. Kitchen staff might share in leftovers and have access to ale and bread. Yet the work environment in kitchens and stables posed risks: burns, accidents with sharp tools, and exposure to extreme temperatures. Peasants relied heavily on grain, legumes, and seasonal vegetables. Meat formed a smaller portion of the diet for many tenants, unless the household permitted hunting or provided meat as part of wages. Disease and poor sanitation affected both groups. Over time, improvements in storage, in living arrangements, and in medical knowledge influenced outcomes, but basic risks persisted. Legal status marked a sharp distinction between servants and peasants. Many household servants were free individuals who contracted to serve, and who could, in principle, leave for another employer. Others were in a form of limited servitude bound by apprenticeship or tied to a specific household through customs. Peasants often held land by customary tenure. Some were freeholders, but others were serfs or villeins bound to the manor. These obligations limited their freedom to move and required specific services to the lord. Nonetheless, customary law and local practice sometimes allowed for negotiation, for the buying out of obligations, or for gradual changes in status over generations. Social difference also showed in daily proximity to the lord. Servants working inside the inner court moved within spaces that required discretion and observed household etiquette. They served at the table, cleaned the chambers, and managed private stores. Villagers rarely entered inner spaces except for official business. Market or legal business took them to the outer court, to the gatehouse, or to the steward's hall. In this way, access to spaces mirrored social divisions. Marriage and family life reflected these divisions as well. Servants sometimes married within the household or nearby. Household rules could regulate marriage, especially when servants were young or when their duties required continuity. Villagers married according to local custom and often formed networks of kinship that structured labor cooperation, such as in harvest time. Over time, alliances through marriage could alter a family's prospects, especially when a tenant acquired additional land or when a servant gained favor and moved into a higher position. Security and protection offered by the castle formed an important connection between servants, peasants, and the lord. The castle provided a fortified point in times of trouble. Tenants who lived near its walls relied on this protection against raiders or local disputes. Meanwhile, household servants took an active part in the defense through the watch and through the maintenance of gates and walls. In this way, the castle was both a workplace and a refuge, with reciprocal expectations of service and security. Interactions between household staff and villagers were routine and practical. Markets, mills, and workshops created regular points of contact. Craftsmen from the village repaired tools, delivered barrels, or provided services to the household. Wedding and funeral processes connected families across social lines. At the same time, social boundaries remained visible in custom and in etiquette. Respect for rank and for the lord's authority shaped behavior in public spaces. In this way, daily life mixed cooperation with clear social markers. Over time, economic changes affected these patterns. The growth of coin economies, the expansion of markets, and shifts in agricultural practice influenced wages and mobility. Some households began to hire more free laborers who received coin wages. Others relied on traditional corvée and in-kind payments. Regional variations mattered, and castles in trade-rich regions showed different labor arrangements from those in more isolated areas. Meanwhile, crises such as poor harvests or disease could force households to renegotiate terms, to reduce wages, or to tighten discipline. Finally, consider the human side of this organization. Those who served in kitchens, stables, and guardrooms performed necessary tasks that required skill, judgment, and endurance. Peasant families managed subsistence and sustained the agricultural base that supported the household. Both groups shared routines of care: mending, feeding, cleaning, and attending to children and elders. Their lives intersected at the mill, the market, and within the rhythms enforced by law and custom. In this way, the castle functioned because many people carried out ordinary work, day by day, season by season. In conclusion, servants and common folk formed an integrated world within and around the castle. Hierarchies organized labor. Wages, punishments, and customary obligations shaped behavior and conditions. Peasants living on castle grounds combined family life with agricultural duties, while household servants fulfilled roles that kept the inner household running. Differences in legal status, in space, and in daily routine marked social divisions. Yet cooperation and mutual dependence tied the community together. Rest with the sense of that steady order, where simple tasks and fixed responsibilities sustained a larger structure of life and service. Food was a constant presence in medieval life, shaping work, seasons, and social order. People thought about it in practical ways. They planned stores, arranged kitchens, and assigned tasks. Across social ranks, what ended up on the table depended on land, wealth, access to markets, and religious practice. Meanwhile, the same basic needs were met with very different ingredients and with different expectations. Nobles ate a wide variety of foods when compared to most commoners. Their table often included large portions of meat. Beef, pork, and mutton were common on noble tables when the household budget and the season allowed. Hunting supplied venison, boar, hare, and other game for the table. Birds were important as well. Ducks, geese, capon, and on special occasions, swans and peacocks appeared at banquets. Fresh fish and salted or dried fish were part of the diet too, especially on fast days or in households near rivers and coasts. Bread made from fine wheat flour was expected at noble meals. Wheat produced a white, light loaf that symbolized status. Refined breads, tarts, custards, and sweet dishes appeared when supplies permitted. Spices and imported fruits made savory and sweet dishes more complex and more costly. Wine, often imported or produced on estate vineyards, accompanied meals and marked social rank. Commoners ate differently. Their diet depended on local crops and on what they could raise or gather. Bread remained central, but it was coarser. Rye, barley, and oats were more common ingredients for the village loaf. Pottage, a thick stew or porridge of grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables were available, formed a daily staple. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, and root vegetables supplied most of the plant-based nutrition. Meat was less frequent for many families. Pigs were commonly kept because they could forage, and pork or lard appeared more often than beef. Poultry might be kept as well, but larger animals like cattle commonly served agricultural work and were slaughtered less frequently. For commoners who lived near water, fish and eels supplemented diets. Bread and ale together made up a basic, dependable meal pattern for many households. Preservation and preparation determined what people could eat beyond immediate harvests. Salt was the most important preservative. It removed moisture and reduced spoilage, and it therefore allowed meat and fish to be stored for months. Salting took place in barrels or tubs. Fish, especially cod and herring, were often split, salted, and dried. Smoking also extended the life of meat and fish. Curing in smokehouses produced products that could travel and be stored through winter. Drying and air curing preserved fruits, herbs, and meats in different climates. Meanwhile, pickling in vinegar or in brine provided another way to preserve vegetables. Honey and sugar served as preservatives for fruit preserves and confectionery, although sugar remained a luxury in many regions for long periods. Over time, storing in cellars or cool, shaded rooms became a preferred method for keeping root crops and cider apples through the colder months. Preparation took many forms. Roasting on a spit remained a classic technique for noble tables. A whole animal turned over an open fire produced a centerpiece dish and required a trained cook and a team to manage the spit, the heat, and the seasoning. Boiling in cauldrons provided pottages, broths, and stews. The boiling cauldron could take grain, beans, and vegetables, and it served as the daily pot for many households. Baking was a communal or specialized task. Ovens were expensive and time-consuming to maintain, so village ovens sometimes served many households. In large households, a bakehouse produced bread for the lord and his retainers. Frying in fat or oil appeared as well, although fat was often saved for occasions. Pastry and pie making used lard or butter as shortening, and baking techniques developed into multiple forms of tarts and filled dishes. In a castle or manor, specialized spaces supported these activities. The kitchen sat close to the great hall for practical service. It contained hearths, spits, cauldrons, ovens, and work surfaces. Nearby lay the larder, a cool place for salted and smoked meats, and the pantry, where bread and dry goods were kept. The buttery stored ale and wine. A separate dairy or butter chamber handled milk, butter, and cheese production. These rooms required oversight. A steward or head cook managed supplies, while scullions and servants carried out the labor. In a large household, specialist roles included the pantler for bread, the butler for drink, and the carver who prepared and served meats at table. In this way, food preparation connected organization, labor, and the physical layout of the household. Ceremonial banquets followed rules and customs that went beyond the need to feed people. They expressed rank, reinforced alliances, and marked special dates. A banquet could celebrate a wedding, a treaty, a harvest, or a religious festival. Preparations began well in advance. Stores were gathered, special animals slaughtered, and recipes planned. Dishes were selected to display variety and abundance. Service often followed patterns. In some periods and places, a sequence of courses arrived for the guests in a planned order. In other contexts, many dishes might be placed on the table at once, allowing guests to choose. The arrangement of seating reflected the Lord's power. High-ranking guests sat nearer the head of the table. Lesser guests filled the outer places. Honor and precedence guided where one sat and how one was served. Tableware and service carried symbolic meaning too. Wooden trenchers or boards originally served as plates for many households. At the noble table, pewter, carved wood, and sometimes metal plate were used. A trencher might be a thick slice of bread at the table of commoners, but among the wealthier the trencher was often a wooden board upon which meat and side dishes were placed. Napery, cloths, and tablecloths marked formality. Eating habits differed. Fingers, knives, and spoons were normal. Forks were rare in many parts of medieval Europe until later centuries. Guests washed hands before and after eating, often at a basin placed near the table by attendants. Sharing dishes and drinking out of communal cups or flagons was common. Although noble households sometimes provided individual cups. Rules of etiquette governed behavior. Do not reach across higher-ranked guests. Take from the side of a dish rather than from its center, and show deference to those above you. These customs made meals a social performance as much as a physical necessity. Banquets often included display food, an element meant to impress rather than to nourish. Subtleties, edible sculptures, and decorated pies presented by servers functioned as visual markers of wealth and taste. Preparing such creations required time and skill. In this way, the arrangement and presentation of food conveyed messages about the host's connections, the household's reach for luxury, and the social importance of the occasion. Minstrels or entertainers often provided sound and movement while guests ate, and ceremonial toasts and formal speeches completed the event. In this way, a banquet combined dining, theater, and status. The role of wine, ale, and spices influenced both everyday meals and festive ones. Ale and beer were staple beverages for many communities. They provided calories, were safer than often unreliable water supplies, and could be consumed by all ages. Ale brewed from barley or other cereals varied in strength and flavor. Households of all sizes had brewing practices, and local ale reflected local grain and yeast characteristics. Wine occupied a different social position. Produced from grapes in suitable climates or imported from other regions, wine became associated with higher status. Noble households maintained cellars and wine lists. Wine could be served plain, but it was frequently mixed with spices, sweetened with honey or sugar, and sometimes warmed. Hippocras, an infused spiced wine, or mulled wine appeared at special meals or during cold seasons. Monks and clerics in some regions produced wines of notable quality for both liturgical and secular use. Spices played a distinctive role. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger arrived from long trade routes and brought flavors unfamiliar to many local cuisines. Their cost made them prestige items. Nobles used spices to mask or to transform flavors, to show connection to trade networks, and to display their ability to procure rare goods. Spices also served medicinal roles in contemporary understanding. They appeared in meat dishes, in sauces, and in sweetmeats. Over time, the use of spices became more widespread. But during much of the medieval period, their presence on the table remained an indicator of wealth. Religious rules shaped the presence of meat, fish, and wine. Fast days and seasons such as Lent required abstention from meat for many Christians. On those days, fish became particularly important. Salted and dried fish allowed people to observe fasts without exhausting fresh supplies. In addition, saints' days and feasts punctuated the year. Seasonal festivals produced special recipes tied to harvest times, such as meat pies at Michaelmas or specialty breads at Christmas and Easter. In this way, the calendar organized consumption, and households planned stores and menus with those dates in mind. Daily meals reflected a rhythm of work and ease. Simple breakfasts might consist of bread and ale or pottage. The main meal, often called dinner, came in the middle of the day for laboring people, and sometimes later for the household's upper members. Supper appeared in the evening as a smaller meal. In noble households, the timing of meals depended on court routines and on daylight. Servants served food in stages, and carvers apportioned large pieces for the guests. Over time, the number of meals and their timing varied with region and season, but the practical need to feed a working body remained constant. Preserving taste and nutrition required attention. Stews and pottages combined grain and legumes to provide sustained energy. Bread served as a utensil and as a filler. Dairy products added fat and protein. Cheese was an important preserved form of milk for many communities. In households with surplus, butter and cheeses could be traded or salted for storage. Fruit, fresh in season and dried for winter, furnished vitamins and variety. Nuts and seeds provided fat. In this way, diverse techniques of preservation and a range of ingredients sustained people across the year. Work in the kitchen demanded skill and endurance. Cooks balanced complex schedules, managed fires, and matched supplies to menus. Scullions cleaned pots and prepared vegetables. Bakers and brewers kept ovens and vats operating. Servants carried heavy dishes to the hall and coordinated service. At large banquets, coordination resembled a small operation. Teams handled roasting, baking, pastry, and service simultaneously. Hygiene standards differed from modern expectations. Nevertheless, care in cooking and in storage reduced spoilage and limited waste. Food connected daily life to larger economic networks. Spices traveled from distant lands. Salt and preserved fish moved along coastal and river trade routes. Grain and livestock exchanged hands locally or in markets. Tenants provided dues in kind and labor to support the lord's household. Meanwhile, market towns offered access to new goods and to specialized producers. Over time, the expansion of trade and the increasing use of coin altered access to foodstuffs and allowed some households greater choice. In the end, the food of medieval life rested on practical decisions about preservation, preparation, and presentation. Nobles and commoners shared basic techniques, but celebrated different varieties and quantities. Banquets announced power and alliance through variety and pageantry, while daily meals met the steady needs of labor and family. Wine, ale, and spices marked status and taste, and preservation methods kept stores through seasons of scarcity. Remember this steady work of hands and of planning, where ordinary routines of cooking and storage sustained households, and where special meals drew together people for moments of ceremony and community. Rest with the sense of those rhythms, simple and organized, that shaped daily life around the table. Castles were built with defense as their primary purpose. Stone walls rose from earthworks and timber palisades, and each element served a clear function. A surrounding ditch, often filled with water where geography permitted, kept attackers farther from the base of the wall. Towers projected beyond the curtain wall to allow defenders to see and to fire along the wall's face. Gatehouses combined heavy doors, portcullises, and murder holes to control entry. In this way, architecture worked like a system, each part supporting the others. Design varied by place and by period. Early Matan Bailey designs used a raised earthwork topped with timber defenses. Over time, stone replaced wood for its greater resistance to fire and to battering. Walls thickened, and towers became rounder to better deflect blows. Meanwhile, concentric designs added layers of defense. Inner walls provided an ultimate refuge if outer defenses failed. Gates became more complex, with forecourts and barbicans that forced an attacker into confined, exposed ground. These changes reflected experience and technological advances. Builders learned from each siege and adapted their plans accordingly. Attackers developed tactics to overcome these defenses. Siege warfare was deliberate and patient. Armies invested a fortification, surrounding it to prevent supplies and reinforcements from entering. Mining sought to undermine walls by removing foundations. Sappers dug tunnels under targeted sections, propping them with timber until set aflame or collapsed to bring down the masonry above. Siege engines such as battering rams, mangonels, and trebuchets provided tools to break gates, or to batter walls. In some cases, engineers built wooden siege towers, allowing soldiers to reach wall tops and to cross onto battlements. Negotiation and deception also formed part of siegecraft. Blockades sometimes became wars of attrition, where the hope of surrender grew as food stores dwindled. Terms could be offered that allowed for honorable withdrawal, ransoms, or occupation. Alternatively, attackers might attempt to bribe a gatekeeper or to find treachery within the walls. Fire could be employed against timber elements, and smoke forced defenders to relocate. In this way, siege warfare mixed technology, logistics, and human judgment. Defenses relied not only on stone and timber, but on the people who manned them. Guards and garrison troops held the parapets, watched the approaches, and maintained the mechanisms of defense. Those responsibilities required equipment. A range of weaponry appeared across medieval landscapes, from simple to elaborate. Longbows and crossbows stood out for their ability to strike at a distance. Longbows, when used in skilled hands, offered rapid fire and substantial range. Crossbows required more time to cock, but their mechanics allowed even less trained soldiers to deliver powerful bolts that could penetrate armor. Polearms and spears provided reach for foot soldiers. Halberds, glaives, and pikes kept mounted attackers at bay. Swords remained a general-purpose weapon for those who fought at close quarters. Heavy cavalry carried lances for charges, and once engaged, knights relied on swords, maces, or axes to continue combat. Meanwhile, defensive items such as pavises, large shields used to protect crossbowmen during reloading, helped sustain missile troops under fire. Armor evolved in response to the changing nature of weapons. Early mail, a woven armor of interlinked rings, provided flexibility and light protection against cuts. Over time, plate armor covered more of the body to resist the increased power of polearms and the penetration of bolts. Helmets shifted from conical nasal types to enclosed forms that protected face and throat. By combining mail with plate elements, a balance of mobility and defense could be achieved. Yet armor varied by wealth and by role. Wealthy knights and household retainers might wear well-crafted plate, while levies and archers often had limited protection, such as helmets and gambesons, a quilted defensive garment. Weapons and armor demanded maintenance. Metalwork needed regular cleaning to prevent rust. Leather straps required oiling to remain flexible. In this way, readiness was a daily concern. Armories stored spare weapons and repaired equipment after combat. Blacksmiths and armorers practiced skills that sustained fighting forces. Their work kept hinges turning, bolts straight, and blade edges serviceable. Training formed the foundation of martial skill. Noble youths began learning martial disciplines at an early age. A typical progression started with time in the household of an experienced family or patron. As a page, a boy learned manners, horsemanship, and the basics of handling weapons. Later, as a squire, he assisted a knight, maintained equipment, and practiced combat techniques. Over time, he learned to mount and dismount quickly, to control a horse under stress, and to coordinate with a lance in the saddle. Training included repeated, measured practice. Shield work, sword forms, and lance charges took many hours to master. Foot soldiers trained with polearms and in the formation tactics that would allow them to fight as a unit. Archers practiced shooting with weight and consistency, developing the physical strength and rhythm required for long-range warfare. Meanwhile, cavalry and infantry practiced maneuvers to execute coordinated attacks. In this way, training combined individual skill and collective discipline. Tournaments became structured settings where martial skill was tested and displayed. At first, they could be rough affairs, resembling small-scale battles among armed men. Over time, rules and codes emerged to reduce serious injury and to regulate conduct. Jousting competitions allowed riders to charge against each other, with lances aimed at unseating an opponent. Lists, the areas set aside for tournaments, were bounded spaces with stands for spectators and areas for armorers and squires. Tournaments served many purposes. They offered practice in a relatively controlled environment. They displayed status and wealth. They tightened bonds between nobles. Spectators watched carefully, and success in these events could advance reputation and political standing. Organization for such events required planning. Marshal-selected rules governed the use of force, the sorting of participants by rank, and the awarding of prizes. Tournaments sometimes included pageantry, music, and feasting, yet they remained centered on skill and discipline. Meanwhile, common soldiers and lesser nobles found opportunities for advancement through visible accomplishment. In this way, training and tournaments reinforced the military culture that supported castle defense and warfare. Life during a siege tested all these preparations. A siege introduced prolonged pressure on both defenders and attackers. For those behind the walls, fear and uncertainty accompanied the constant noise of engines, the labored steps of enemy siege towers, and the occasional barrage of stones or incendiary material. Sleep became fragmented. Guards kept watch in shifts. Sentries took turns scanning the approaches and checking for sappers. At the same time, craftsmen and laborers worked to repair damaged sections, to shore up weakened parapets, and to clear rubble from assaulted gates. Supplies shaped the course of a siege. Food and water mattered more than immediate valor. Each household stocked provisions in anticipation of trouble. Granaries, cellars, and stored barrels determined how long a garrison could resist. When supplies dwindled, choices grew more urgent. Leaders rationed supplies, limiting portions and prioritizing essential functions. Meanwhile, morale depended on news from the outside and on the expectation of relief. Without hope of rescue, endurance faltered and the likelihood of surrender increased. Hunger became a daily concern in a long investment. Initially, stored grains and salted or smoked meats provided sustenance. Over time, those stores lessened. People turned to less desirable foods, and scavenging within the castle complex increased. Mobiles such as dairy animals that remained within the walls could supply milk, but they were also a resource that leaders could slaughter to extend survival. Wasteful practices were avoided by necessity. In this way, scarcity reshaped ordinary routines. Disease and sanitation posed additional pressures. Close quarters, stressed supplies, and disrupted routines increased the risk of illness. Water sources, if contaminated or limited, became a hazard. Waste disposal required management to prevent further decline in living conditions. Meanwhile, injuries from bombardment or sallying actions demanded attention. Surgeons and healers worked under difficult conditions to treat wounds and to limit infection. Their skills often decided whether a wounded combatant could return to duty or whether a minor injury became life-threatening. Psychological endurance mattered as much as physical readiness. Leaders tried to maintain discipline and to provide clear orders. Signals, such as trumpet calls or flags, organized responses to sudden attacks. Religious practices continued where possible, offering routine and consolation. Ceremonial acts marked the passing of time. Meanwhile, stories of past sieges or the presence of relics sometimes sustained morale. In this way, community rituals and clear command structures helped maintain cohesion. When relief arrived, it often came from a field army attempting to break the siege. Attackers then faced a new threat as they had to protect their lines and to confront outside forces. Battles for relief could be decisive, lifting sieges and restoring supply lines, or they could fail and leave the defenders to continue their ordeal. Negotiations sometimes followed a show of force, and terms for surrender could protect the lives of the garrison. In this way, the interplay between operations inside and outside the walls shaped outcomes. After a siege, whether successful or not, recovery required work. Rebuilding damaged walls, tending to the wounded, and replenishing stores became immediate tasks. Meanwhile, lessons filtered back to other fortifications. Architects and commanders changed tactics, improved fortifications, and adjusted training to account for new threats. Over time, advances such as improved cannon and gunpowder altered the meaning of walls and towers, and defensive architecture changed in response. Yet for long periods, the basic interplay of fortification, armament, training, and endurance remained central. Defense and warfare around castles combined material design, human skill, and logistical planning. Stone and timber provided a framework. Weapons and armor determined the modes of combat. Training and tournaments shaped the habits of arms and the social structures that supported martial readiness. During sieges, the human elements of fear, hunger, and endurance came to the fore. In this way, military life centered not only on brief moments of violence, but on extended periods of preparation, adaptation, and sustained attention to simple needs. Remember these steady actions and careful practices. They defined how communities lived when defense mattered most, and they explain how castles functioned as both shelter and stage for acts of war. Religion shaped daily life inside a castle in steady, practical ways. It organized time, gave form to events, and offered words for moments of anxiety or joy. Inside the stone walls, a chapel provided a fixed place for these practices. It was not merely an ornament. The chapel was an active part of household routine, and its use was woven into ordinary responsibilities. The chapel stood near the heart of the household. Sometimes it occupied a small, separate building inside the bailey. In other cases, it was a room within the great hall complex or a private space attached to a noble chamber. The size and decoration varied with the wealth and taste of the family. A simple altar and a cross could serve as a focal point. Where funds allowed, stained glass, painted images, and a carved altar conveyed a more formal setting for worship. A bell often hung nearby to call people to prayer, and its sound marked changes in the day. Daily prayers followed a rhythm that people in the castle learned to expect. The hours of prayer, arranged through the canonical hours, divided the day into moments of devotion. Early morning prayers began before dawn. Later, mid-morning and midday prayers divided work and study. Vespers gathered people as evening came. Between these set offices, a mass might be sung on important days. The sound of chanting or of short readings organized pauses in routine. In this way, the chapel created structure in time and in thought. Mass remained the central act of public worship. The priest prepared the altar, arranged the vessels, and celebrated the Eucharist, a ritual understood as the heart of Christian practice. Household members, retainers, and servants attended when they could. Nobles often took a place near the front. The language of the service was Latin for much of the medieval period, and that Latin formed a stable, recognizable pattern of words and gestures. Still, people understood much of the meaning through repetition and through practical explanation by the chaplain or by visiting clergy. Private devotions supplemented public worship. A noble might pause to make the sign of the cross before setting out to ride. A household member could kneel in a small oratory to say brief prayers for protection during travel or battle. Personal items such as small crosses, rosary beads, or images of a favored saint provided ways to focus thought. These practices were quiet and private, and they often followed the formal shape of liturgical prayer. The chapel also served practical functions. It hosted baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Newborns received the sign of belonging through baptism performed at the altar. Weddings took place with blessings and vows, marking legal and social ties. When someone died, a funeral service accompanied by prayers for the departed became a public moment of grief and memory. In times of disease or injury, clergy administered the last rites, offering comfort and the rites prescribed for those near death. These sacraments bound the household into the wider order of the church. Religious life inside the castle reflected the broader influence of the church on noble life. Bishops and abbots held social and political weight. Their authority extended beyond spiritual matters. Church courts handled many legal disputes. Canon law regulated marriage, inheritance, and other aspects of family life. Nobles sought the church's approval for certain actions, and they often relied on clerics for counsel. Meanwhile, the church depended on noble patronage for buildings, lands, and protection. In this way, relationships between nobles and clerics were reciprocal and practical. Patronage took several forms. Founding or endowing a monastery or a chantry served spiritual ends and expressed social position. A chantry involved sponsored masses for the soul of a founder. Over time, endowments ensured that prayers would be said for a family after death. Monasteries received gifts of land, and in return, provided spiritual services, education, and sometimes medical care. By supporting churches and religious houses, nobles connected their household to a network of spiritual institutions that extended beyond the walls. Education and record-keeping offered another avenue for church influence. Clerics often served as secretaries, chancellors, and advisors. They read and wrote documents, managed accounts, and composed letters. Their literacy made them indispensable in governance. A noble household valued a learned chaplain who could draft charters and negotiate with other powers. In consequence, clerical men could become central to household administration and decision-making. Religious instruction affected daily manners as well. The church taught about sin and virtue, about duties to family and neighbor. Those teachings informed ideas of honor, charity, and obligation. Confession and penance provided a mechanism by which individuals accounted for their actions. Nobles and servants alike made use of the sacrament of confession. In this way, the church shaped personal conduct as well as political life. Alongside formal religion, popular beliefs and practices filled the spaces of everyday experience. People in and around a castle paid attention to signs and to objects believed to carry power. Relics, or physical remains associated with a saint, occupied an important place in devotion. A relic could be as simple as a fragment of bone, a cloth, or a piece of wood. Reliquaries held these items with care, and they were displayed during processions, feast days, or when a household sought special protection. The presence of a relic mattered because it connected a local community to the life of the wider church and to the memory of a holy person. Pilgrims traveled to see famous relics, but smaller households kept minor relics for everyday reassurance. People attributed miracles to the presence of relics. Visitors might report answers to prayers or healing after touching a relic. Clerics documented such claims when they served pastoral or administrative needs. And over time, a saint's cult could grow around noted examples. Omens and portents formed another strand of belief. Dreams, unusual births, comets, and sudden animal behavior attracted attention. A long illness might be read as a sign of divine displeasure. A series of poor harvests could be interpreted as a test of communal faith or as a warning to change conduct. In this way, people sought meaning in events that otherwise seemed random. Nobles consulted advisors and clergy when such signs appeared. Sometimes the advice focused on practical responses, such as repairing a church or supporting a feast. Other times, it called for personal reflection and penance. Folk practices existed alongside official liturgy. Simple charms, amulets, or written prayers provided a sense of protection. Households placed blessed objects near doorways or carried small icons on journeys. Bells were used not only for calling to prayer, but also to mark out moments when household members should pause and listen. During storms, people rang bells to call for divine aid against thunder. In some instances, clergy approved of such actions as expressions of faith. In others, they discouraged practices seen as superstitious or derived from older customs. The boundary between accepted devotion and condemned superstition was not always sharp. Church authorities sought to regulate practices that seemed to conflict with doctrine, and pastoral guides advised priests on how to respond to popular beliefs. Penitentials, manuals that listed sins and prescribed penances, included entries on superstitious practices. Clergy often worked to redirect popular energy toward approved forms of devotion, such as pilgrimages to recognized shrines or participation in prescribed festivals. Monks, priests, and confessors formed the workforce of spiritual life within and around castles. Each group had a distinct role. Monks were members of religious communities who lived under a rule. Their days followed a strict schedule of prayer and work. They sang the divine office, copied books, managed estates, and offered hospitality. A nearby monastery could supply education, counsel, and medical care to a castle household. Monks also maintained libraries and preserved texts that shaped intellectual life over generations. Priests provided direct pastoral care. A secular priest attached to a castle acted as chaplain. He celebrated Mass, heard confessions, and performed the sacraments. He visited sick household members and offered counsel to families. In many households, the chaplain lived within the castle and shared in daily rhythms. His presence made religious practice accessible and immediate, and it gave a point of contact with larger diocesan structures. Confessors held a special place in noble society. To be a confessor meant to be entrusted with the inner moral life of a person. Nobles sought confessors not only for routine confession, but also for ongoing spiritual guidance. A confessor could advise on moral decisions, on the ordering of one's household, and on public conduct. Those who acted as confessors sometimes exercised considerable influence. They balanced the confidentiality of confession with their role as moral advisors. This position required trust, and it demanded that the confessor be learned in both theology and pastoral care. Medical and charitable work linked religious houses to the needs of a castle. Monasteries often ran infirmaries. They treated wounds and tended the sick. A chaplain in a castle might help with basic care and administer last rites. Religious communities provided a network of assistance that extended beyond individual households. When disaster struck, nearby houses of religion sometimes offered shelter or supplies. Discipline and moral teaching also formed a continuing concern. Clerics admonished against excess, against cruel treatment of dependents, and against breaches of promise. They encouraged acts of charity toward the poor and stressed obligations to those in need. In theory and in practice, the Church set moral standards that influenced how people conducted business and how households treated those under their care. Over time, religious practice within castles changed as social and theological developments altered expectations. New devotional movements placed greater emphasis on personal piety and on the effective experience of prayer. Reforms altered monastic life and adjusted the relationship between secular clergy and their bishops. Still, the central functions remained recognizable. The chapel continued to mark the day. Clergy continued to provide sacraments, counsel, and care. Popular beliefs and superstitions persisted in various forms, and relics and signs continued to shape how people sought comfort and meaning. Religion inside a castle combined formal rites, personal devotion, institutional influence, and popular practice. It structured time, supported governance, and offered ways to manage uncertainty. Through chapels, through monks and priests, and through popular expressions of faith, religion reached into the practical tasks of daily life. In this way, it became part of the steady background of action, thought, and care that made a castle a secure place to live and to meet the demands of the wider world. Inside a medieval castle, questions of health, cleanliness, and care were part of ordinary life. People noticed what made others well, and they learned habits that fit the material and social conditions of their world. The measures they took were practical and often shaped by what was available nearby. Over time, these habits formed a steady routine for daily living and for responding to illness. Bathing had a different place in medieval life than it does today. Full immersion baths continued in some places, and at certain times, people used public bathhouses in towns. Within a castle, Private bathing depended on resources. When water could be heated and carried, a wooden tub or a large basin might be set in a chamber and filled for a soak. Servants assisted with heating the water and with undressing. In many cases, bathing was not a daily ritual. People washed their faces, hands, and feet more often than they bathed their whole bodies. A basin and cloth, warmed water, and soap or a cleansing herb could refresh a person between fuller washes. Linen played an important role in personal cleanliness. Because cleaning garments was often easier than washing a body, nobles in particular prized a frequent change of linen. Shifts, undergarments, and bed linens were laundered when possible. In the process, clothing could be aired and mended. In this way, a sense of cleanliness was maintained even when full baths were infrequent. Meanwhile, combing and grooming the hair, paring nails, and removing dirt from the face were parts of daily attention for many residents of a castle. Perfumes and scented substances were common. People used them for pleasantness and for practical reasons. A pomander, a small container filled with aromatic substances, might be worn or carried. Rosewater, vinegar infused with herbs, and aromatic oils were applied to linen or used to scent a room. Spices and resins were burned in small quantities, and herb bundles were hung near beds. Scented gloves and perfumed handkerchiefs were fashionable among the wealthy, and they also played a role during travel. In this way, scent became a measured part of daily comfort. Concerns about smell also influenced practices associated with disease. When people noticed bad odors, they sometimes associated them with sickness. To counter these odors, households burned herbs or used scented cloths. Later medical thought and popular belief often connected foul smells with danger, and thus smells helped shape responses to illness. That belief led to the use of perfumes in both ordinary life and in care for the sick. Medieval medicine drew on a mixture of long-standing medical theory, practical observation, and inherited remedies. The dominant theoretical framework was the doctrine of the four humors. Health was thought to depend on a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When one humor was in excess or deficiency, disease followed. Physicians trained at schools and universities applied this theory in diagnosis and treatment. They examined the pulse and urine, asked about diet and sleep, and sought to restore balance through diet, purging, bleeding, or medicines. Alongside learned medicine, practical remedies abounded. Apothecaries and household healers kept recipes for poultices, decoctions, and ointments. Honey was widely used for wounds, since it was known to be soothing and to keep dressings from sticking. Vinegar and wine appeared in many preparations. Herbal remedies included willow for pain, various mints for digestion, and chamomile for skin and stomach complaints. Meanwhile, more elaborate mixtures were created from combinations of herbs, spices, and mineral substances. A simple wound might be cleaned, an herbal poultice applied, and the area bandaged with clean linen. Some remedies now seem strange to modern readers. A few treatments made use of animal parts, such as powdered hoof or dried skins, because of analogical reasoning common in medieval thought. The use of certain minerals, including mercury for some chronic conditions, was based on long practice despite the risks. Bezoar stones, rare concretions taken from animals, were prized as antidotes to poison. Mummia, an ingredient derived from embalmed remains or from bitumen, entered some recipes as an internal medicine. These practices reflected a different understanding of the body and its needs. They also reflected scarcity and the value placed on rare items. Surgery had its place as well. Barber surgeons, who combined haircutting, tooth extraction, and basic surgical techniques, worked at wounds, fractures, and abscesses. Procedures included suturing, setting broken bones, and occasionally amputation. Cauterization, the application of heat to close or sterilize tissue, was used in some cases. Surgical work required steady hands and knowledge gained from experience. It could also be painful and carried risks of infection. For that reason, simple surgery was often performed only when the need outweighed the danger. Illnesses that circulated in a castle reflected the wider patterns of medieval disease. Respiratory infections spread in close quarters during winter. Children faced high risks from infectious fever and from common childhood diseases. Gastrointestinal illnesses were frequent when food or water was contaminated. Epidemics shaped life dramatically. Leprosy was visible in some communities and carried a social stigma that affected how people lived and interacted. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, struck slowly and persistently. Meanwhile, periodic outbreaks of plague returned in waves after the major pandemic of the 14th century. That pandemic, often dated from about 1347 to 1351 Common Era, caused an extraordinary loss of life across much of Europe, and later recurrences continued to affect populations. Mortality rates were high by modern standards. Infant and child mortality made life expectancy at birth low. Many children did not survive their first years. If a person reached adulthood, chances improved, but adults still faced significant risks from infection, accident, and childbirth. Estimates vary by region and period. In broad terms, life expectancy at birth in many medieval societies might have been in the range of 30 to 35 years, though this figure rises for those who survived childhood. In this way, statistics reflected both the prevalence of early death and the resilience of those who lived longer. Childbirth presented a particular danger to women. Maternal mortality could result from hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor. In many households, birth was managed by experienced midwives who worked with practical techniques to assist delivery. They knew to prepare warm cloths to support the mother during delivery and to deal with complications when possible. Sometimes, a surgeon was summoned for difficult cases. The risk of death from childbirth was a constant presence in women's lives, and it shaped attitudes toward family, succession, and household arrangements. The role of healers inside a castle was varied and often complementary. A well-managed household included people who provided different kinds of care. A chaplain offered spiritual comfort and might provide simple remedies. Monks from a nearby monastery, when available, provided herbal medicines and advice. An apothecary or steward kept a store of medicinal herbs, preserved simples, and prepared mixtures for common complaints. Meanwhile, a barber surgeon addressed external injuries. In larger households, a physician trained in university medicine might be retained for consultation. In smaller households, a practical healer or a wise woman fulfilled many of these duties. Midwives held specialized knowledge. Their work combined practical skill, communal knowledge, and ritual practice. They assisted with prenatal care as it was understood at the time, suggested diets and positions to help the mother, and employed herbs believed to encourage labor or to ease pain. Midwives also cared for the newborn, advising on feeding and hygiene. A midwife might be respected in a community for her competence and experience. In emergency situations, she worked alongside male practitioners if one was available, and sometimes passed responsibility to a more formally trained surgeon. Healers also played a social role. People trusted those who had proven effective and who knew the household. Trust mattered in matters of privacy and in decisions about costly or risky interventions. A confessor or a chaplain might advise on matters where medical and moral concerns intersected. Meanwhile, a steward or the head of household made choices about whom to summon and how to allocate scarce resources. In this way, health care worked through networks of people rather than through a single professional. Prevention mattered as much as cure. Household routines included measures to reduce risk. Food was stored, salted, smoked, or dried to keep it from spoiling. Wine and ale were common drinks. Their alcoholic content reduced some risks from contaminated water. Kitchens used boiling and long cooking in many dishes. Waste was managed through guardrobes and cesspits, and households tried to keep living spaces ventilated when weather allowed. Over time, these practices reduced certain hazards, even when their meaning was not expressed in modern scientific terms. When epidemics struck, responses included isolation of the sick when possible, relocation to less crowded quarters, and reliance on clergy for spiritual care. Religious houses and hospitals also provided support. In many towns and communities, institutions established by charitable foundations cared for the sick and the poor. These institutions combined basic nursing, prayer, and simple remedies. They were not hospitals in the modern sense, but they offered important services to those in need. Medical knowledge changed slowly. New texts and translations reached physicians and surgeons, and over the centuries, there was a gradual accumulation of practical experience. Still, much treatment remained conservative and experimental by later standards. Remedies combined observation with inherited theory. Some interventions helped, some did not, and some caused harm. Nevertheless, the combination of household care, skilled attendance, and community resources meant that many people recovered from common illnesses. In the quieter moments inside a castle, care took everyday forms. A child with fever lay on a pallet, attended by a parent. An injured arm was supported with splints and bandages. A midwife rubbed the back of a laboring woman and spoke encouragement. A household servant warmed a compress and bathed a wound. These small actions were the ordinary work of maintaining health in a setting where formal medical institutions were often distant. Ultimately, life in a medieval castle balanced realistic practices with the limits of contemporary knowledge. Cleanliness took practical forms: changes of linen, face washing, and the occasional bath when water and fuel were available. Perfumes and aromatics helped manage odors and comfort occupants. Medicine combined learned theory and hands-on remedies, from humoral treatments to poultices and surgical interventions. Common diseases and high mortality shaped family life and household planning. Healers and midwives provided essential skills and steady care. In this way, health, hygiene, and medicine were woven into the rhythms of castle life, forming a steady background of attention and action that made daily living possible. A castle was not only a place of defense and administration, it was also a center of social life where work and ceremony met, and where people of different ranks shared time together. Entertainment and festivals formed part of the rhythm of that life. They marked important moments, helped to maintain relationships, and offered a relief from routine tasks. In the rooms and courtyards of a castle, music and poetry, tournaments and hunts, religious observances and seasonal celebrations, and the telling of romances and legends filled days and nights with sound and story. Music and poetry were among the most constant presences in a castle. Minstrels, jongleurs, and trained singers came to perform for a lord and his household. Some were attached to the household and served as regular entertainers. Others traveled from place to place, carrying news and songs. Instruments were simple and portable in many cases. A stringed instrument such as the lute or the viol accompanied a singer. A small harp or a psaltery provided sustained tones. Wind instruments, like flutes or shawms, and small percussion instruments gave rhythm for dances and marches. A trumpet or a clarion might sound for processions or to announce an arrival. Meanwhile, singing could be solo or collective. Religious songs and secular songs coexisted. A chapel choir performed liturgical music during services. In the Great Hall, a minstrel's song could recall a recent victory or describe an heroic feat. Over time, some melodies and texts became well known across regions, while others remained local or even unique to a single household. Poetry included courtly lyrics, moral verse, and narrative poetry. Troubadours and trouvers composed and performed poems about honor, loyalty, and love. Courtly love was a frequent theme, expressed in carefully measured lines and pointed phrases. Poetry could flatter a patron, praise a lady, or mock a rival. Jesters and fools also played a role in the musical and poetic life of a court. They sang, danced, told jokes, and offered commentary that allowed a degree of license. A jester could speak frankly about the behavior of nobles in ways that a retainer might not. In this way, humor and satire provided a social check as well as entertainment. Performances were balanced between planned displays and spontaneous moments. A banquet might include a prepared piece, followed by improvised lines from a clever jongleur. Tournaments and hunts brought movement and spectacle to castle life. Tournaments began as exercises in training for war and gradually developed into public contests with rules and ritual. Jousting in the lists featured single combats between two knights on horseback. A tilt or a pass tested skill with the lance. Melees involved larger groups practicing formations and tactics under controlled conditions. Pageants and processions accompanied these contests. Armor and heraldic display made the event visible from a distance. Women of the household often took part in the ceremonies by awarding prizes, by composing verses for favored knights, or by supervising preparations. Tournaments allowed knights to show their skill, to win reputation, and to secure patronage. They were also occasions for large gatherings, where political conversations and alliances were made. Hunting held a steady place in noble pastimes. It served both practical and symbolic purposes. Hounds, falcons, and horses were essential equipment. Different kinds of hunts required different skills. A stag hunt relied on mounted riders and packs of hounds to track and bring down a large animal. Falconry used trained birds of prey to catch game. Huntsmen managed the dogs, while falconers cared for the birds and trained them. A hunt began with preparation, the assembling of supplies, the checking of hounds, and the posting of beaters. Laws and customs often restricted who could hunt certain animals and where. That limitation reinforced social hierarchy. Meanwhile, the return from a successful hunt concluded with the distribution of meat and the counting of honors. The manner of the kill and the handling of the carcass followed customary rules, and the event provided food for feasts as well as material for conversation. Games of chance and board games provided quieter diversion. Chess, as it was known in Europe, offered a game of strategy and reflection. Players studied formations and tactics, and the game carried social meanings about order and rank. Tables, a forerunner of backgammon, required skill and a degree of luck. Dice were used for gambling. Such games could be played for small stakes or for greater sums, depending on the players and the occasion. Gambling attracted debate about propriety. Some authorities discouraged it, while others accepted it as part of leisure. Card games appeared later in the medieval period and added another form of play. In private chambers, a small group might play by flickering candlelight, while in a great hall, a larger contest might draw spectators who enjoyed seeing a skilled player succeed. Religious festivals shaped the calendar of castle life in a steady way. The year followed the liturgical cycle, and major feasts brought pause to ordinary routines. Christmas marked a season of special services and extended feasting. Epiphany, Candlemas, Easter, and Pentecost each carried distinct observances and customs. Saints' days and local patronal festivals gave reason for further celebration. During these times, the kitchen prepared dishes that would not be served on ordinary days. Meat appeared after a fast, and the arrangement of the table reflected the importance of the feast. In addition, masses and processions involved members of the household and servants in acts of public worship. Alms and gifts to the poor were often given during festivals, and that act connected the household to the wider community. Seasonal celebrations also included harvest festivals and market days that linked castles to surrounding villages. Michaelmas marked a key date for accounts and the settlement of rents. In this way, economic cycles and religious observances intersected. Processions, banners, and liturgical music accompanied many public moments. In some places, dramatic performances grew from liturgical practice. Mystery plays and miracle plays developed in towns and sometimes reached noble households. These performances depicted scenes from the Bible or the lives of saints. They could be solemn or lively according to the local custom. A castle might host traveling players who performed short dramatic pieces, or household members might take parts in a staged presentation. Over time, such plays contributed to communal memory and to the dissemination of stories across social boundaries. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were moments when celebration and ritual met closely. A wedding combined legal settlement, feasting, and entertainment. Musicians, minstrels, and sometimes poets took part in the ceremonies. Gifts and formal exchange of vows or contracts took place among families and witnesses. A funeral involved prayer and remembrance, with food and almsgiving as part of the observance. These life cycle events were public and private at once. They reinforced family ties and the household's obligations to lineage and neighbor. In the evening, storytelling and the recitation of romances and legends were central to domestic entertainment. A narrator might sit near the table or on a raised platform and speak, while listeners sat or leaned on benches. Long narratives such as chansons de geste, Arthurian romances, and local sagas were told over several nights. These stories blended history and invention. They recounted battles, quests, and the deeds of famous figures. In addition to long romances, shorter tales, saints' lives, and moral exempla were common. Storytellers used repetition and clear structure, so listeners could follow events over an extended telling. In this way, narrative became a shared experience that shaped memory and identity. Romances often addressed themes of loyalty, bravery, and love. Courtly literature presented codes of behavior. A knight might be praised for fidelity to his lord and for courteous treatment of a lady. Meanwhile, tales of trickery and cunning offered different lessons about prudence and wit. Storytelling also included news and local history. A household learned of births, marriages, quarrels, and alliances through spoken report as well as through song. Storytellers and readers served as keepers of the past, passing down genealogies and remembering the deeds of ancestors. That practice helped to maintain continuity across generations. The tone of evening entertainment was usually calm and composed. Conversation, jokes, and lighter songs alternated with serious narratives. A master of ceremonies or a steward could regulate the order of events, deciding when music would give way to a tale or when the hall would clear for rest. In chambers where the household was smaller, readings from manuscripts might supplement oral performance. A lord or lady might request particular stories or recitations, and in this way, a personal taste influenced what was told. Over time, certain tales became associated with particular families or regions, and a sense of shared repertoire developed. Entertainment and festivals served practical social functions as well as offering pleasure. They displayed status and hospitality. They reinforced social bonds among retainers and neighbors. They provided training in manners and skills, especially through tournaments and music. They allowed rulers to reward service and to secure loyalty. At the same time, they gave ordinary people the chance to rest, to speak, and to take part in shared memory. In this way, festivals and amusements were woven into the governance and rhythm of castle life. When one considers the full pattern of entertainment in a castle, a clear picture emerges of structured leisure. Music and poetry offered both private comfort and public performance. Tournaments and hunts tested skill and provided spectacle. Religious feasts and seasonal customs marked the passage of the year. Storytelling and romance created a common store of narratives that guided behavior and preserved memory. Together, these practices shaped the social fabric of a castle, providing rhythm and variety in the daily life of those who lived within and around its walls. Castles were once central places for defense, governance, and household life. Over centuries, they changed in form and purpose. In this narration, I will explain how new technologies undermined fortress life, how many castles became palaces and estates, how archaeology and preservation have shaped our knowledge, and how castles continue to appear in modern culture. I will move through these developments in a calm and measured way, following a long but steady line of change. To begin with technology, the introduction and development of gunpowder weapons altered the basic assumptions of castle design. Gunpowder had arrived in Europe by the 13th century CE in small and experimental forms. By the 14th and 15th centuries CE, cannon and other artillery had become more reliable and more powerful. A heavy metal ball or stone could strike a high curtain wall repeatedly until the mortar weakened. In response, attackers refined siege tactics and defenders tried to adapt. Over time, attackers used massed guns, battering techniques, and coordinated approaches that made traditional high, thin walls vulnerable. Meanwhile, defenders added devices such as earthworks placed against walls to absorb impact. In some cases, they built temporary platforms for their own guns to return fire. These measures helped in the short term, but they did not restore the earlier balance between offense and defense. Later developments changed the form of fortification more completely. Engineers and military thinkers experimented with lower, thicker walls that could better resist cannon shot. Bastions and angled works appeared in the 15th and 16th centuries CE. In Italy, new forms of fortification emphasized geometry, thick earthen ramparts, and outward-facing defensive angles that allowed guns to cover adjacent walls. This so-called trace Italian or Italian outline did not preserve the old look of a medieval castle. Instead, it produced low, sprawling forts optimized for artillery. Castles that had been built to command the high ground and to repel hand-to-hand assaults could not be easily adapted to these new standards. As a result, many medieval castles lost their military importance. The wider military and political changes also reduced the need for private fortified residences. Centralized states grew stronger during the late medieval and early modern periods. Monarchs found it increasingly practical to maintain professional armies and controlled garrisons rather than to rely on the feudal levy. A standing army could be moved according to national rather than local needs. In this way, power became more concentrated in capitals and royal courts. Meanwhile, the economic burden of maintaining a castle as a military installation remained high. Guns, powder, and trained artillery crews required expense and supply. Many nobles chose to invest in comfortable residences, administrative centers, or agricultural estates instead. Castles that had once provided local defense were no longer essential to a lord's power or to the security of a region. Practical changes followed these strategic shifts. Many castles were garrisoned less frequently. In some areas, governors or sheriffs used former castles mainly as administrative hubs or prisons. Others fell into disuse. Stones were taken from older castles and reused in new buildings. Over time, some castles became ruinous because they were no longer maintained. In other cases, owners deliberately slighted them, which is to say they dismantled key parts to prevent reuse by enemies. That practice was common in the 15th and 16th centuries CE during political conflicts, where control of fortifications mattered. In this way, the decline of castle life was not an abrupt event, but a series of adaptations and choices across generations. As military needs changed, so did the taste and aspirations of the nobility. Comfort, display, and courtly life became more prominent. Many families remodeled their residences to emphasize light, space, and convenience. Windows were enlarged. Interiors received paneling, tapestries, and carved furniture. Kitchens moved or were redesigned for different culinary expectations. In some instances, a castle's defensive features were kept, but altered to allow for a more domestic use. Arrow slits were widened into mullioned windows. Towers acquired chambers for private use, rather than simply for watch or defense. In other instances, owners pursued a complete transformation. During the Renaissance and into the early modern period, some noble families built palaces rather than fortified keeps. A palace prioritized symmetry, formal gardens, and rooms for ceremony. Architects who worked for powerful patrons designed new residences that reflected classical principles of proportion and order. In France, for example, the shift away from medieval fortress models culminated in ambitious projects. Louis XIV is associated with a palace where grandeur and court ritual were central to statecraft. In England, Henry VIII adapted and expanded older royal residences into spaces better suited for a royal household and court life. These examples show how architecture followed a change in social function. A seat of power became as much a place for ceremony and administration as a place for direct defense. Elsewhere, the change was more gradual. Some castle owners kept certain defensive forms as symbols of status, while converting internal spaces for comfort. Courtyards that had once served military mustering were converted into formal gardens or service yards. Gatehouses became ceremonial entrances. In this way, medieval features remained visible but served new purposes. Estates broadened their economic base as well. Landed families focused on agricultural management, rents, and legal administration. Castles that had once overseen border defenses instead came to anchor local governance and hospitality. Over time, the castle as private fortress gave way to the castle as noble seat and a state center. When structures fell from use, their memory did not entirely disappear. Interest in medieval remains grew in different forms. Antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries CE surveyed and drew castles. Collectors gathered objects from ruins. At the same time, restoration and preservation movements took shape. Some restorations sought to preserve the historic fabric and stabilize buildings so that they would not collapse. Others involved reconstruction, sometimes based on conjecture or on contemporary tastes. A notable figure in restoration practice was Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, who worked in France during the 19th century CE. His interventions were influential, but also controversial, because he sometimes restored buildings to what he considered a coherent whole, rather than to their precise historical state. Archaeology brought new methods to the study of castles. Excavation allowed researchers to examine layers of occupation and to recover everyday objects that rarely appear in written records. Finds of pottery, tools, bones, and metalwork helped to reconstruct diets, craft practices, and trade. In the 20th century CE, archaeological science introduced techniques such as radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, which allowed more accurate dating of wooden structures and sieges. Remote sensing, including aerial photography, and more recently, LiDAR, revealed buried features of castle landscapes and related earthworks. These tools opened new perspectives on how castles were integrated into their wider territories, including roads, fields, and defensive networks. Conservation practices also changed. Specialists developed approaches to masonry consolidation, to the control of vegetation that can damage mortar, and to the slow management of decay. Legislation in many countries protected historic monuments and provided resources for maintenance. Museums and heritage organizations began to interpret castles for the public. That interpretation included not only grand narratives, but also the everyday life of servants, craftsmen, and soldiers who lived within and around castles. Archaeological work often involved local communities, and public archaeology projects invited non-specialists to participate. In this way, preservation became both a technical and a social effort, aimed at conserving material remains and at conveying their human meanings. In recent decades, a new layer of scholarship has added nuance to our understanding of castles. Scholars have questioned simple narratives of decline and persistence. They have emphasized regional differences, the variety of castle forms, and the long-term adaptability of some sites. Some castles were continuously occupied and modified for centuries, while others were abandoned early. Research has shown that castles functioned in multiple registers, as military sites, as centers of administration, as houses of hospitality, and as symbols of power. Archaeological evidence has complemented documentary records to provide a fuller picture of domestic life, labor organization, and the material culture of medieval households. Beyond scholarship and preservation, castles continue to live in modern imagination and culture. They form a visible part of many landscapes. Tourists visit them in large numbers. Museums interpret rooms and objects. Reenactments, medieval fairs, and educational programs recreate aspects of castle life for contemporary audiences. In addition, castles appear in literature, film, and digital media. They provide settings for historical dramas, for fantasy stories, and for games. Video game designers and filmmakers often borrow castle forms to convey a sense of the past. Meanwhile, historians and heritage professionals work to balance popular images with accurate information. Interpretive programs aim to correct common misconceptions while preserving the evocative quality that draws public interest. Castles also remain sites of community memory and identity. In some places, a castle stands as a county landmark or as the focus of local festivals. In others, former castle grounds have been adapted into public parks, schools, or civic centers. Adaptive reuse has allowed some buildings to survive because they were given new, practical functions. Churches and chapels within castles sometimes continue in use for worship. Courts, prisons, and administrative offices have sometimes reused older structures as necessary. In this way, continuity is not only symbolic, it can be material and functional as well. Digital technology has added new possibilities for experiencing castles. Three-dimensional scanning, virtual reconstruction, and online archives allow wider access to sites that are fragile or remote. Digital models can show how a castle might have developed over time, illustrating phases of construction and alteration. These tools enhance both scholarship and public engagement. Meanwhile, responsible practice requires that digital displays are grounded in sound evidence. and that they communicate uncertainty where it exists. Finally, the legacy of castles is complex and ongoing. They tell a story not only of walls and towers, but of changing military technology, of political centralization, and of social transformation. They represent the ways people organized power, protected property, and conducted daily life. Over centuries, castles shifted from military strongholds to noble residences, from ruins to subjects of study, and from local centers to global heritage attractions. In this way, the history of castles continues to unfold. New research, new conservation choices, and new cultural uses will shape the meanings of these sites for years to come. Meanwhile, the material remains that survive keep providing evidence and questions. They invite careful study and thoughtful stewardship, so that this long chapter of human organization remains available to future generations. After this steady account, you may let the story rest. Over time, walls were repaired, rooms were refitted, and uses were changed again and again. Some castles fell into ruin, others were adapted for new needs, and many kept a quiet presence in local life. Meanwhile, researchers, conservators, and communities continue to study and care for these places. In this way, the history of castles shows practical choices and gradual change rather than sudden endings. Allow your breathing to slow and your thoughts to settle. Good rest.